Hello everyone, welcome back to another video in our Java lecture series. Today we are going to start getting more deeper into dealing with your data in your Java programs. And this is typically tied with a concept that we like to call data structures. So the first data structures that are usually introduced in Java are arrays, and that's what we are going to cover today. So let's go ahead and take a look at what arrays are. So first, let's cover why do we need these arrays. So as you continue to build your programs, you'll start to use a lot of different variables within your program, and they're going to hold values that are going to work inside of the program itself. So let's take this example. Let's say you're creating some program that's going to have to store 5 different scores. Now, what you've known so far is that you can create 5 different variables to hold those 5 different scores. So, arrays are actually going to help solve this problem so that you don't have to create the scores individually. You can create them in a group or a collection. So, if you were to do them 5 separate scores, obviously it would be hard to manage because you would have to deal with each 5 scores independently. It would be hard to iterate through or use a loop with. It would be hard to update those values again because you have to update them individually. And it also just doesn't scale. So every time you would need a new score, you would have to create a new variable and assign the value to it. So to solve that issue, this is where arrays come into play, and that's what we'll be discussing today. So an array is what you would consider a fixed size collection of values that have the same data type and are stored in order. Now the order component is important. The way that the items are entered is the way that they will remain. So order is technically important in this case. Now, basically with arrays, what happens is you're going to store multiple values in one variable instead of separate variables. So in this case, we could have one variable called int scores that has all of those 5 scores instead of us having 5 different variables with 5 different scores. So it's basically a way to store things that are in common all in one variable. So think of it as sort of a container. Now, they do have a fixed size once you create it, and that size is depending on the elements inside of it. But the elements inside of that array have to be the same type, and when I'm referring to type, I mean data type. So what's an array element? It's basically going to be that singular value that's going to be inside of an array. So you can have as many elements in an array as you would like, but each one independently is what we consider an element. So each element is going to have an index, which is going to be the position. So what position in the array is it at? And it's also going to have the value or the data value that it's going to hold. So here is kind of a visual representation of what an array looks like visually. Not that it actually is exactly like this, but to give you an idea of how it is set up. So at the top, you see we have those numbers from 0 to 9. Those are going to be your indexes, meaning the position that that element is at. And the green boxes would represent each data value. So you could have anything in these green boxes, but they're each going to be an independent element, each green box. And overall at the bottom, you see there is a length. So it's telling you how many elements are in your array. But if you take a notice, the index is not going to be the same as the length. That is because your indexes do start at 0. So when you're working with declaring and creating your arrays, there's various ways you can go about it. So we'll cover some of the ways you may see and or find interesting for yourself personally. So first, declaring an array. This is when you're going to tell the type or the data type and the variable name that is going to hold the array. But this does not mean that you're creating the array. It's just basically, let's think of it as a placeholder. So you're basically saying, hey, here's the data uh, that I want to store, or the data type, I should say, and this is going to be the name of this container or this array container that these data types are going to live in. So if you take a look, this is how you would create it. Now, first you would mention your data type, followed by empty brackets, and then you give it the array name. So if you take a look at the examples, we have our data type, followed by our empty brackets, and then we gave it an array name. So in this case, we have int ages, which means we will have an array named ages, and then the next example, we have string names, which means we have an array called names. Ages is going to hold integers only, and names is going to hold strings only. And that is basically how you would declare an array. Now, when it comes to creating an array, there are different ways you can do that. So when you're creating an array, you have to tell Java the data type that it will store, or basically you would have to do the declaration first. So in this example, you see the only thing that's different from the previous is that we are adding on the assignment operator followed by the keyword new, followed by that data type and the size of the array. So in this case, we are going to tell Java the data type that that array is going to store and the number of elements it will hold. So if you take a look at our examples, at the bottom, we have int numbers and we have string names. And if you take a look, both of those have those keywords of new. And yes, new has to be all lowercase. And you do have to specify new every time you create an array. But we have new, and then we follow it by the data type, which we have matching the first data type we provide for the array. And then inside of the brackets, after you declare the data type, is where you would put the size. So how many spaces will this array have for values? And this is overall the easiest way to create an array, but it is not the only way. So there's also a second way that we can do this, and that would be by declaring our array first and then creating it second. So on two separate lines. And this is typically going to be useful when you don't know the size of the array. So for example, you may ask a user to enter information, but you don't know how much information they're going to enter. In this case, you could give them the option to let you know, and you can establish the array size based on what they provide you. So that would be a use case of this. So basically what's going to happen is you're going to first declare that array, just how we saw in the previous slides. And then once it's declared, you can then refer to it by that array name, and then you can assign it the values. So it's basically like breaking apart the previous slide where we had it all in one line. It's just basically breaking it into two pieces instead of having it all at one time. So they basically do the same thing, but again, the way and the order they are created are a little bit different. So what happens when we actually create this array? So what's going on in the background is Java is actually allocating memory for this array, meaning it's saving space for the values you are going to provide. And once we create it, those elements are going to get default values because when we created it on the previous slides, we did not give it data values. We just simply said this is how much space we need and this is the data type it's going to be and this is the name for it. We did not specify what's going to be in the array. So when you do create and declare an array, it just gives it default values. So if you have numbers, they're basically all going to be 0. For example, Booleans, they're all going to be false, which is basically, again, just going to be your standard 0 value. And you have null for objects. So it could be class objects, or it can even be strings. So that is kind of what happens in this case when we are creating our array. So to give you an idea when I mean Java's allocating memory, think of your memory as like a block of memory or space that is going to hold your array size. So just think of it as space in your program, somewhere that's going to store it. It's like a storage unit. You might not necessarily need a big storage unit for a few items. So just think of it something similar to that. So arrays again have a fixed size because that memory block is not going to grow or shrink. So you're basically telling the array, hey, this is how much I need you to hold, and it's not going to change. And here is a visual representation of that. If you take a look, you see that we have a memory block that will be created if we were to do numbers, for example, that numbers array. We're saying that we're going to have an array that's going to have 5 numbers in it. And again, our index starts at 0. So our index will go from 0 to 4 because we're not doing 1 through 5. We are doing 0. So that would make it 0 to 4. And by default, when we create that array, all of those integers are going to be 0 because we are not initializing or giving it a value just yet. So that's basically what's going on when you are creating an array. There's no values there yet, but we're just basically creating the quote-unquote storage container for all of these data values that you are looking to store in the array. So now let's get into how you would actually give it a value. And this is what we get into with the initializing your arrays. So initialization is actually the term that's given when you are actually telling your array its starting values. So this is going to happen after that array is declared or created. So you may hear both of these terms, but to pretty much give you an idea of the difference, creation is going to refer to when you're giving it that amount of memory it will need and setting the array size, while initializing or initialize means that you're going to give the actual array values or fill it with data. So there's 2 ways we can initialize an array. Your first way is going to be to assign it one value at a time based on that index or the position within that array. If you take a look at this example, we are going to try to fill in our numbers array. In this case, we said that it's going to hold integers. We're calling the array numbers, and it's going to hold 5 integers in it. Now again, when you assign it, we're assigning it by our index. And remember, our index starts at 0. So when you are assigning it, you would need to start at the index value of 0 and work your way up to 4, in total creating 5 different data values. In this case, you see we call our array name, we give it brackets, and we provide the index number inside of that, and then we are giving it a data value. So number 0 means at the first position, we want 10. The second number, numbers 1, we want 20, and so on and so forth. So inside of that bracket after the array name is the actual index that you are going to be assigning that value for in the array. Now, the second way, which is one of the most common ways, is just to use an initializer list. And this is going to create and initialize the array in one line. So it's going to save you time and lines of code. and it will automatically determine the size of your array based on the number of values you provided. So here we have multiple examples of what that would look like. But basically, when you are using an initializer list, please notice that we are using curly braces and commas to separate the data or the elements in our array. So we're saying, for example, we're having a array called numbers, which is going to hold integer values. And we're saying that our data values are going to be 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. And all of these are enclosed inside of curly braces. So that is important. You do always need to include the curly braces, but each data value inside of the curly braces is going to be separated by a comma. And what happens is, once you do this, each of those values are given an index, again starting at 0, and that is how it is going to be created and initialized. So this is an example of how you could do it all in one line, and this is actually one of the common ways to do it. So now that we kind of have an idea of what arrays are, how to create them, now let's see how we can actually work with them. So first, you can access the elements inside of an array. So that means you just want to retrieve a value and use it somewhere else in your code. And to do this, you would use the index. And remember, our index is going to start at 0. So how to access that element would simply be by providing that array name and then the index that you are trying to access. That's pretty much it. So for example, in our integer array of numbers, we had 10, 20, and 30, and 40. So let's say we wanted to access a specific element out of our array. We would use the index, and we'll state what that is. So if you're accessing the element, one of the things you could do is store it as a variable once you access it, or print it out, or use it in some way within your program. So there's various ways you can use the access element, but in this case, we're showing you an example of pulling out a value from an array and storing it as its own independent variable. So if you see, we created here a variable called value, and it is basically going to store whatever data point or data value is at the second index of our array numbers. So it's going to find that. In our case, remember, because we start at 0, our second index of numbers is going to be 30 and not 20 because we start at 0. So 0 is 10, 1 is 20, and 2 is 30. So in this example, we are going to be printing out 30 to the user. Now, when you're accessing an element, you have to make sure that you are requesting an index value that exists, meaning do not try to request to access an index value that is not possible for that array. So if you only have, in this example, you have 4 data values. If you were to do numbers 4, that would give you an error because numbers 4 does not exist. You may think number 4 exists because we have 4 data values, but again, our index actually starts at 0. So we never have an index number 4. So if you were to do numbers 4, it would cause an error, and this is one of the most common mistakes a lot of people come across, is assigning or requesting an index that does not exist. So you do have to kind of remember and keep in mind that your indexes are starting at 0. Now, let's say there's a case where you want to modify your elements. This is just pretty much changing the value of it. Again, what you would do is use the index and just assign it a new value. So very much similar to accessing it. The only other thing is we're adding the assignment operator and the new value to it after that, followed by our semicolon, of course. Now, an example of this would be let's say we have our numbers array again. Let's say we want to change the second data value in our array. So that would be 20. So let's say we want to change 20. If we want to change 20, we're just going to say the index value for 20, in this case, which is 1. So we would say numbers 1, and then we're going to say equals the new value. In this case, we're going to say 99. So if you take a look, after that occurs, that means numbers is then going to hold 10, 99, 30, and 40 instead of 10, 20, 30, and 40. So you can change a element after you have created an array, but you would need to access it and reassign it a new value by utilizing its index number. So as you start to work with bigger arrays, they are going to have a length, and sometimes you need this length to do other things in your program. And pretty much you have something called array length, which literally is going to tell you the number of elements in this array. So you provide the array name followed by length. In this case, there are no parentheses. So you may be thinking, oh, it sounds like a method. It is not technically a method. This is actually something that's built in that allows you to work with the length of your arrays. So in this case, you do not need any parentheses after length. You just simply say array name dot length. So here's the example of that. Again, with our numbers array, you see we're trying to print out to the user numbers.length. There are no parentheses after length. The parentheses you see are the parentheses that belong to the print statement, but there are no parentheses after length itself. And under that is a visual representation of kind of what is happening in this other example, or the one above it. You see we have an array, has 4 data values. There are 4 indexes from 0 to 3, but the length is 4 because there are 4 data values, although our index only goes to 3. So that is one of the most common confusing components of the array, but as you continue to work with them, it should stick and make more sense. So overall, I know that covered a lot about arrays, how to store data, and typically a lot of people have a rough time understanding the concepts just from first seeing it. So we are going to basically just consider this the start of learning arrays. There are a lot that you can learn with arrays because again, array is considered a data structure, and there can literally be entire class on data structures alone. Arrays could be explained in 3 or 4 weeks depending on how detailed you want to go. But being that this is just an intro to Java, we are going to pretty much stop it at the basics, but I am going to do another lecture on arrays to get a little bit more complex, but not too deep that it's confusing to you from a beginner's point of view. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot more to arrays than what I've shared in this one lecture, but I will cover a little bit more details coming up very soon. So overall, what we covered today was what an array is, how do you declare them, how do you initialize them or give them a data value, what you can do with the array elements overall, and how you can work with the array lengths. Again, we're just getting started in arrays. We will get more detailed in the next lecture, but I want to give you time to process what we have covered here so that it makes more sense moving forward. So before we get into those detailed results, we will get into a coding tutorial of just how to create, declare, and initialize your arrays, and how to work with those elements, as well as the length. And then after that, we'll get more detailed into arrays and what other things you can do with them. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all in our Array Basics coding tutorial.